Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be, and welcome to today's webinar with Mastercard. Sorry, let's get this down here. From Master Recovery Insights, looking at 2021 travel trends and outlook for August 2021. We have a great program ahead of us with some great speakers from our good friends at Mastercard. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Paul Brangan. I am the Director of Communications and External Affairs at the Pacific Asia Travel Association, also known as PATA, and I am your host for today's webinar. As always, I do just have a quick just technical notes to go over with you. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but just as a refresher regarding how to use Zoom, as you very well know, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a toolbar with both a chat function and a Q&A. For the chat function, feel free to say hello and engage with other participants and the speakers. Say hello, where you're from, maybe some comments about what you're seeing from the presentations. However, if you have any questions, please don't use the chat function. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function as shown on your screen. If you put your question in the chat function, it's sometimes difficult for the moderator to go back and forth between chat and Q&A. For the chats, please do keep them cordial and respectful of one another. And with that, that is all I have to tell you about how to use Zoom, but I'm sure many of you are very familiar with it. I'm sure we've probably all have been through hundreds of webinars over the past year and a half. So with that, we've come to the webinar proper. And with that, I would like to welcome to the webinar Andreas speaker, David Mann, sorry, and there's a third one, Mayank Dutt. And with that, I'll pass this to Andreas. Andreas, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and a warm welcome from us at Mastercard. Thank you for the opportunity that we could come in and present this to you today. I want to introduce you then straight away into the first topic in terms of the macroeconomic sides. Then we afterwards will go into a little bit more of a deep dive around what we see around travel return on leisure and business with some segmentations. And at the back end of the webinar, Mayank and myself are going to talk about how do we take these insights and bring them to action. Starting with the first point, and I also ask you as we go ahead, do post your questions because we want to keep this also partially interactive as good as we can on webinars and try to come back to your questions early and give them response time. Now, as I'm going to move to the first section, I'd like to introduce to you David Mann. David Mann is our Chief Economist for Asia Pacific, Middle East and Africa. He comes with a vast and huge amount of knowledge and background from his previous jobs to Mastercard, and he's been in the last 12 months with really deep diving into some of those insights, what's happening on the macroeconomical side, and what does that mean for us in the travel space that we need to sort of take away as key learnings to keep in mind. Because the core question is, are we talking about recovery back to 2019 levels, or are we talking about how travel is evolving, morphing, changing, and is actually already starting to grow again and recover in a positive sense? With that, over to you, David. I'll zoom out and leave the floor to you.
Thanks, Andreas. And it's a great pleasure to be here to be presenting some of our thoughts from the Mastercard Economics Institute on what we think is going on in the global economy, what's going to be coming next, in particular for travel, and what therefore are the knock-on implications that it could have for everyone on the call. Now, the beginning point, unfortunately, that we have to have with any conversation about economics at this stage in the crisis is all about the projections or estimates that are out there for herd immunity, a very theoretical concept that is a moving target given the different types of COVID strains that are out there, the Delta variant being the one that has been most dominant at the moment. When we zoom in on the various parts of the world, we can see a clear story where the greens here represent those who are vaccinating the fastest and heading most rapidly towards herd immunity. So the US, Canada, various parts of Europe are on the list, including Scandinavia. Some parts of the Middle East, for example, including the UAE and Qatar are also on the list. And then when we zoom in on Asia, the one thing that stands out is you have to zoom in on the smaller locations, including Singapore, that's just about visible there in green, or indeed go over to Hong Kong to see places that are likely to be able to achieve some form of herd immunity this year. And this relatively slower pace of achieving herd immunity in the Asia Pacific region versus what is being done in the advanced economies in the West, including in the US and in Europe, that is a major issue, partly because of the success, you could argue, of last year of COVID being kept under control for most of the markets in the region, though of course not for all of them. But also as a result of that, there was that much less of an urgency on rapidly racing to roll out the vaccines. Now, that situation has already changed. We've seen economies such as Malaysia really picking up the pace recently. Japan also, whenever we've gone through periods where we've seen a slower period than faster, it's usually been triggered by some sort of improvement that has been needed in the amount of vaccinations because of further surges in cases and further lockdowns over the course of this year. And that has been the case in the case of Malaysia, where it's coming out of lockdown. Singapore is coming out of its effective stringency measures as of this week. But also that extra amount of impetus on getting vaccines is something we should remember is a cumulative process. So over the next 12 months, there'll be a lot more greens in this picture than there are right now. And there will be much more opportunities as we see more of the herd immunity projections getting closer to something towards those theoretical levels, which could be as much as 80 to 90% of populations required to be vaccinated to count towards being herd immune, given how contagious the current variant, the Delta variant, is. We always know, of course, there are different issues to watch for of even further mutations than this. We know there'll be more treatments that could be coming out, that could be approved, that could help to deal with the virus, that could help remove the whole need to focus as much as we are focused today on this issue of how many people as a percent of the total population have been vaccinated. But that's a critical part of the entire story, unfortunately, that I'll be talking through today, because we are in an imbalanced, non-linear recovery, but there is a recovery. And we know that we're seeing the advanced versus emerging markets. We're seeing advanced economies doing better. They applied that much more stimulus, both monetary and fiscal policy-wise. Just as a key statistic, in the United States, more quantitative easing policy measures were taken in the last 12 months than had been the case in the prior 12 years before 2020. And on top of that, extreme measures also being taken on fiscal policy stimulus. That was not able to be as aggressive a story for emerging markets that are relatively more vulnerable to also tighter US financial conditions in the coming year or two, as we start to get some beginnings, I would argue, very early beginnings of a normalization in US monetary policy. But applying the most monetary and fiscal stimulus and the most vaccines is helping to bring in one of the big first points I have on the key takeaways today, and that is excess savings. This to us portends much stronger spending in the future. It suggests that we're going to see those savings that are built up as people have not been able to move around or travel or go through those priceless experiences of going around various parts of the world to enjoy going on a holiday, that they can start doing that once again. They have the money to do it. There could actually be more of the challenge coming on the supply side rather than the demand side, a little bit like we've been seeing in other industries, including in the electronic space. The second point I would stress is that while there's plenty excess savings and strong demand and plenty desire and ability to pay for travel, the recovery itself is taking place, but it's more short haul. It is also something that is, in our view, starting in the US, then spreading over towards Europe, between the US and Europe, cross-Atlantic flights, then eventually we'll see more of the rest of the world getting those green lights. And that will be the big issue to watch for. And that's the final point, that the green lights from governments at both ends of any travel corridor we're looking at are critical. And in particular, getting rid or at least easing quarantine restrictions has been playing a role in places that have been testing that out. And the good examples of that include Egypt and the UAE. But in addition, we'll be watching for further progress on vaccines and the treatments that could be coming out that could potentially, depending on how it goes, become game changers. But that's something that is still a major uncertainty. One extra point I would stress on the recovery itself is that while leisure travel has been leading the recovery, corporate travel is not dead. And that is what I'll be able to show you in some of the data a little bit later. But before I do that, I would like to come on to this section to talk about the actual forecast for GDP and how they've been evolving in 2021. And of course, the expectations have been moving according to stringency metrics that either have been loosening up and allowing more activity and leading us to expect more activity to take place in places such as Hong Kong or indeed in Singapore, or the more challenged locations around the region where we've seen further outbreaks without enough vaccinations implemented so far that have been triggering more downgrades to growth forecasts. Now, as you see on the left, around the world as a whole, in particular in North America, in the UK, and in a few other selected economies such as, say, Turkey, we've seen upgrades compared to where we were at the start of this year in growth expectations for 2021. But when we compare it to the region that we're in, when we go through to think about the AP story, in particular for the Philippines, for Indonesia, for Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam also, there has been some challenges that have come in that have led to some reductions in the sentiment that had been a lot more optimistic earlier in the year. Now, as we get more vaccines implemented, this story should start to change. And one of the big parts that I believe is most positive about what we should be expecting next is that the pent-up savings, when we look around the world at household deposits, we can see that actually the growth of those deposits has been relatively robust in all across the advanced economies of the world. And when we look at these numbers for levels of household deposits versus the trend, that excess amount over and above the dotted line on the bottom left chart compared to the orange line, that gives us some guide of just how big the excess savings numbers are. In the case of Singapore, it's something closer to around 10% of annual personal consumption expenditure. In the US, it's more like 17% by our estimates as of Q1 of this year, and it is very high across the board for the majority of advanced economies. And it's a story we believe is also the case around the advanced economies in the Asia Pacific region as well. Now, this more positive excess savings story is something that to us suggests that we're going to see, as I say, even stronger demand when it is actually allowed. And that's the big challenge. Now, what's the best guide for what's going to come next? I'll show you where we currently are in a moment, where we talk about ground travel and the domestic story. But is that really a meaningful guide to what to expect as we open up, as more options become available? The answer, we believe, is no. And that is why we like to zoom in on what the story has been for the 2019 patterns of where the tourism numbers were coming from. So let's take the example of Thailand, where it had been, of all the economies in the region, one of the most exposed, of course, to tourism, with more than 10% of GDP being the net surplus that Thailand runs on its tourism balance between inbound and outbound. And we've seen that, of course, understandable collapse that came in 2020. Now, with that, we also need to look into where were the locations, the countries of origin, the folks that were coming in, where were they coming from? To answer that, we can see China ends up occupying a pretty large portion, for example, for Thailand. For other economies around the Mekong Delta region, that is also true. But for economies in Southeast Asia, say Indonesia, it's also other neighboring markets that also matter. So when and whether Australia will be opening up to international travel, say at some point in 2022, will matter alongside Malaysia for the Indonesia story. Similar kind of thing with the neighbors mattering, not just China for Malaysia. We know it's also true, if I keep zooming away, I can go down and see a similar type of pattern there for Singapore too. When we zoom up to look at the story that there is over in if I go to, say, Northeast Asia, again, the near neighbors are the ones that we should be focusing on the most. Though we should remember that the ones with the most pent-up desire to travel and also the green light that's more likely coming sooner than later are the ones coming from those places I showed earlier that were in the green. So also those, for those who can do the long haul travel, though that is probably one of the segments most challenged on the supply side, there may well be some demand coming through from there also. Now, what have we been seeing so far from our own data set? When we look at airline spending, this is Australia's view that we look at airline spending in blue, comparing to gasoline station expenditure in orange, and then we look at it versus the crude oil price that we show you in the red in between. Yes, crude oil prices, of course, have gone up. The price at the pump has gone up too. But even after adjusting for that, we've seen a sizable improvement in the amount of demand clearly for the road trip when it comes to transportation. Australia, we've seen it. If I change the view for just a moment over to the United States, it's been a similar sort of pattern. And interestingly, even in Singapore, where we've seen, of course, not much going on airline spending, but plenty spending going on, and this is an index number, comparing it to what we've seen at gas stations, for example. It's interesting that it's even true in economies like Hong Kong. So people are taking the opportunities that they're actually able to get, rather than necessarily, of course, being able to do the things they can't. But does that tell us what to expect for the future? I would argue to look into the future, it's probably better, one, to look at that patterns I was showing you earlier on 2019 tourist arrival numbers of where to expect tourists to come from, or which ones matter the most. And to also look at the economy such as the US, which has opened up probably more rapidly than anywhere else, where we've seen already domestic trip bookings, as I show you on the left-hand side chart, have already improved and recovered to where they were if we go all the way back to pre-COVID conditions. And even international flight bookings have been following suit as well. And that's even before we've seen a lot more places allowing a lot more travel between them and the United States. So as we get more opening up with various parts of Europe, that should also be helping us with that picture. If I change this view over to Australia, of course, there had been a major recovery in domestic, though international not doing so well. And unlike the US, where actually domestic is the most important part of travel, that's not the case, for example, with Australia, where we need to see even more of the demand coming on the international side. That is something that will be constrained for now. But the one thing we have seen in both the US and Australia, of the two markets that are the best examples of what to expect next, consumer versus commercial trips have been moving relatively hand in hand in Australia's case, and with a lag of 4 to 6 months in the case of the United States, where corporate travel bookings have also been there. So while we may expect that the amount of Zoom calls may still be relatively high compared to pre-COVID conditions, even after we are much further along on dealing with the COVID crisis, we should expect that corporate travel is by no means dead, and there is every reason to expect that that in-person type of demand will still be there. But of course, leisure travel, the consumer element, is the first that has been recovering, and that's exactly the pattern that we believe we should expect also to see in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, we've seen in the case of the different travel corridors that have been emerging over the last year or so, the most interesting ones around the world had, of course, been including the domestic Australia story, the domestic US story. And then for the Asia Pacific, we would expect that we will be adding some of those locations to this list starting from 2022. In the meantime, it will still be more a case of the Americas over to Europe and then to elsewhere in the Middle East, Africa region. But as we open up more and see more of that progress on vaccinations, more green lights, we expect that the most interesting stories will also be seen in this region. And then as one final point before I wrap up, and then we move to a bit more of a discussion, so there isn't too much more of the monologue from me, one thing that I think is worth a mention is when we've been looking through the travel data in our advisors side, they've been identifying various categories, various segments of travelers on the leisure side, as well as on the business side. Here is the list for the leisure side between the escapist, the long-haul traveler, the luxury aficionado, the budget deal seekers, the adventurers, and the rejuvenators. And certainly I would expect there's plenty of people on this call who are in the rejuvenator camp or would like to be if they could be. There may even be some in the luxury aficionado camp, though of course that will be one that is relatively slower to recover until a lot more of the green lights and more certainty about being able to go back and forth re-emerge. But on top of that, those who are looking to be visiting friends and relatives or with borders relatively shut for so long will also likely be a pretty strong segment. So I think it's worth leaving as a parting thought that these are different segments that we'll be looking to track also during the travel recovery, which I would like to stress again, it is underway. It is something that we expect to see as an ongoing process over the next 18 months, even few years. This is not going to be something that is all over and all fully recovered in a matter of weeks. It's a much longer process, of course. But with that sort of segmentation, I think it's a very useful way of being able to get a feel of exactly which parts are going forward faster versus those who are a little bit slower. So with that, I'll pass over to Andreas and maybe a bit of a discussion, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Let me just start with two questions because I'd like to add that before we go off into a deep dive of the segmentations afterwards. So you said it's an unbalanced recovery, and you showed us a lot of interesting data points. Are there some spend categories where we've seen that recovery has gone through the roof, or is it still there? Can you give us a little bit of insights on that unbalanced side, how this is really moving around, or is everything just stalled?
Well, interestingly, in the travel report that we released recently, we actually did look into this. So I just actually pulled it up while you were asking the question. Hopefully you can see this one okay. The main thing that we ended up noting was that during the pandemic itself and the lockdowns, of course, we saw quite a few interesting types of goods, including, of course, various digital goods. Fast food, bakery demand was up quite strongly. People went ahead with a lot more hobbies. So we saw a lot more pandemic puppies, literally, being bought. And of course, people going ahead with home furnishings, and where they could, going ahead with going on these camping trips, buying camper vans, as well as, of course, anything that would go with it, going on their bike. I was included in that, by the way, on buying a new bicycle in 2020. But since we've been starting to anticipate coming out of that, we've been seeing even more people deciding it's a good time to go to a barber's shop and the beauty salons. People have been getting a little bit more into the idea that actually they should get some new shoes. They haven't really needed them as much in 2020 compared to what they expect to use. And then as a result of at least some of the domestic travel, you were still seeing people looking to go to tourist destinations. And so a lot of those tourist attractions in, say, Australia or the US, where I showed that strength of the road trip, did very well. The other thing I would note is for SMEs, they ended up actually outperforming in the accommodation space. And I would especially expect that to be because they are more likely to be maybe outside of the more crowded locations in various countries, and ended up being able to take advantage of the captive demand that was there as a result of COVID. The other thing that I think is worth a note is, of course, the aggressive shift to digital that we saw in 2020. That this online purchasing and demand was so strong that it is something that will stick, given how many more people now are comfortable with using digital than they had been previously. And as a result of using it and getting used to it, that is something even of, say, the older age categories of consumers that we expect is also likely to stick.
David, you just put my second question to an answer, because I wanted to come to the digital one, which was brilliant, because I'm going to actually talk about some of that digital insights when we talk about the segments right now. Thank you very much. If there are any further questions coming down the line to David as we continue, just please post them in the Q&A section. I want to talk in the next set also around the pent-up savings, and obviously with the question of the pent-up saving is, who do we need to address? Because fundamentally, it's been imbalanced, as David has said. It's been a recovery or a shift in the consumer sentiment and consumer spend. So there is money out there, and there's money around a lot of different segments. So it's not just the rich which have become richer. There's also a lot of money around in the generation Z, as well as the millennials, to actually then spend and travel. So let me share my screen, and I'll give you an insight in what we've seen coming out of some of those insights that David has shared to us with with segments and deep dive into segments. So when I talk about segments and that, I'm not going to talk about the right side of this deck. I just want to give you a little bit of insights in terms of what's our research showing in the Asian environment around the optimistic outlook and what the consumers want to spend on. And it's no big secret That savings which is there has at the same time also a very huge demand side, which is pent up. People who are willing and are super optimistic that by the end of 2021, they actually can travel. And that's a good sign, because about 6 months ago, that level was far below 50%. So even that we do not see any of those green corridors open, the consumer sentiment is optimistic. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind. And 60% want to actually break the piggy bank and go spend the money on travel before dining and shopping. Not because they have not done retail therapy in the last 6 or 12 months, which a lot of them have done and bought new toys and new activities, but they actually do want to travel. But 61%, which is a good 2/3 of our population, want to travel comfortably, want to travel safe. They do want to visit their families, but they want to make sure that it is safe and that the people are vaccinated. So again, that point that David stressed out is super important. If the vaccination levels are not up, the consumer is not going to move. Now, what has changed is the bucket list. And I think that's something where David has also mentioned on some of the smaller hotels and some of the SME outlets or operators which were serving some of those consumer needs in the less congested areas where you're not elbow to elbow. You're actually going to see that people have put them onto their bucket list. Instead of going from big city to the next big city, being in a 5-star hotel in front of a 65-inch screen and ordering room service, which you could do on a staycation at home as well, they're going to domestic or short-haul travel destinations, which are not as crowded. And we're seeing this coming also across from the European and the US travel recovery. And that is important for us to be able to then actually then see that this makes a lot of sense. Now, let me look at some of those travel trends that we've seen here. And I want to come back to David's point as a starting point, saying, all right, so business is lagging behind, and that's not a secret for Asia Pacific. Consumer, the leisure is leading the pack. Now, Asia Pacific, obviously consumer can only lead the pack on the domestic side, and the business can only lead the pack basically on the domestic and partially international side. I'll come to that point a little bit in a moment. Whereas you can't really fly across different countries. So hence what we see here in terms of leisure recovery is very much focused on those markets which have a huge domestic supply side, which have domestic opportunities. Japan, Australia, New Zealand, some parts of India. There's no China data here, I'll just be very honest. But there are also staycations of Hong Kong and Singapore in there. And there's some very good signs that also when Thailand was partially not locked down, the Thais used to travel. Why do we see in Asia Pacific some of the corporate travel coming through stronger than the US? Is because there is essential corporate travel which is needed. Engineers need to go to power plants and make sure that we have our power productions. The oil companies need to move their people around, so they have to put them into quarantine and have them move. What we have seen obviously on the Asia Pacific side, not yet recovering that fast, is the SME side of the business. Whereas if you look at the US below, and David mentioned that, the US is rocking at this moment. They have exceeded pre-COVID levels on the consumer side with 118 as an index, as well as also on the SME side, but the corporate side is lagging. And why is this? Well, let's also be very cognizant of the fact that a lot of corporate businesses between head offices and regional offices is intra-company, is commuting, or is for MICE, meeting incentive congresses and events, and they have absolutely not happened. The SMEs don't do this. The SMEs don't go visit their suppliers and their customers, and they go to their production plants. And you can see this is really driving the US business recovery. And that is important because that helps the airlines fill the flights during the week and bring up the frequencies and keep the pricings balanced between the back of the cabin and the front of the cabin, or the weekend versus the weekdays. So the US is definitely ahead of the curve, but what that means is there's a consumer sentiment coming across that this is gonna sooner or later, the next 6 months, swap over to other regions. Hence, we wanna make sure that we can actually be ready for that. SMEs will come to Asia. A lot of production is here, a lot of their sales is here. The corporates will not travel that much between their regional offices And if meeting incentives don't come back in 2022, you're going to see less corporate travel come back. It will be about 55%, max 60%, because on average, about 40% of corporate travel is within the head office and the regional infrastructure, it's intra-company travel, and is related to meeting incentives. Now, before I move to the next chart, let me check whether there's a question here. Have you seen an increase in spend with consumer carbon offset? I cannot answer that question because I have got no details on that one there. So I'll pass on. I'll go to the next set of slides, and then we'll look at the next set of questions coming through. Now, David mentioned these segments which we're seeing sort of evolving and morphing around. Now, a lot of these segments in the old days, you would have been targeting the family, the summer vacation year, the more affluent segment, the more the mass market, short-term weekend escapists. We've seen these segments morph around. So one of the most important segments, and I bet on the call here, half of you have some family members in another country. One of the most important segments which leisure is going to drive is the VFR segment, visit family and relatives, especially leaving your country, going to another country. What we are seeing in this segment here, and that's again something super important for any travel business, is that nowadays, compared to pre-COVID, where you went for a week, the consumer is going between 2 to 4 weeks. Why? Because fundamentally, there's a lot of prerequisites which you need to get sorted out, and you're planning an extra time also to be able to see whether there's a change of regulations that how you get back to your home country, or if not, at some process that changed in the home country, you can't even get back. So that means suddenly there's a lot of more spend in the country when those consumers travel to visit their family and relatives, which is related to car rentals, hotels, eating out, where in the old days they would have just stayed with the family. They now spend some more time to rejuvenate, the bottom left, the red box. They spend a little bit more time to basically also work from there, because we have all changed the way that our work-life playbook has changed. And that is that segment at the far left at the bottom, the workation traveler. Because of this new lifestyle that you have a lot of work from home, work from different locations where you're basically living, these long-haul travelers are taking their computers along, and they're basically starting them to work from a different location, which means their infrastructure requirements are also going to be different. They're looking for hotels with high-speed internet. They're looking for hotels or rental properties where you actually have a good infrastructure around to get either decent food so that you can have a snack in the morning and a snack in the afternoon between also having a lunch, and not having to live off of the mini bar and the junk food which is in the mini bar. So we see these trends coming through. I'd like to highlight now that workation segment at the bottom, because you're going to see a couple of very interesting charts coming down the road where that workation segment is really differently moving. We saw that coming through the pandemic in the cold Northern European markets or Northern American states, where the consumer went south to where it was warmer, and they stayed for a very long time there. Now that's again an interesting proposition, because long stay visitors are actually very beneficial for economies, but they have different needs. They come with their computers, they need to be able to work. We've also seen the escapist change its behavior. The escapist used to be the classical weekend escaper, Friday night out, Sunday evening or Monday morning back. The escape is now going for 3 to 5 days, adding on an extra day of vacation because of the unknown uncertainty of disruption may be happening, but also taking his laptop or computer along, combining that with a bit of workation from there. And where are the escapists going? They're not going to the big cities they used to go and the crowded destinations. They're going snacking. They're trying new destinations in the domestic markets. They're going to secondary places, not only for the sake that they haven't been there, because previously they have always gone to the big places, but also checking them out whether that is actually a location I want to go to for a second longer stay, to rejuvenate, or be an adventurer. Now, what is an adventurer? An adventurer is one of those consumers which has taken up new hobbies. David bought a bike. I bought a bike. These people want to take these hobbies now on their vacations. And if you look at the summer period in Europe, what has happened in the Alps of the French, Swiss, Italy, Austria, Germany environment, how those hotels were sold out versus the beach locations, which were also sold out. People came with their toys. They wanted to go use these new activities and exercise these new activities. Hence, again, the infrastructure needed to change. My family owns a hotel in the Swiss mountains, And we didn't have enough space to actually store all those bikes that suddenly the consumers started to bring along when they came back from their trips. So again, changing to the new needs of these consumers and adopting to them. They're also paying a lot of excess baggage fees to transport these sporting goods in the USA. So a shift in that environment towards outdoor activities and exercising your hobbies. The luxury aficionados obviously will still be here, but they're not on the high street retailing adventure only. They're actually going to more boutique locations and going to places which has a high cost, but has less of the retail therapy side of the business as we would see in the past, but a lot more of the exclusivity. So again, if you are very well catering those exclusive segment, they are there, and you will see some of the data points I'm showing you at the next couple of slides, why you have to target on these. Now, David mentioned everything went to e-commerce. A lot grew, and with that, the pie grew. New customer segments came to the e-commerce landscape in their late 60s, which have never gone to e-commerce in their early stage of life. They came with their debit cards. They realized that everything works and that I can get a refund. There's actually a simple way to do a one-stop shop. And these are the budget deal seekers, which we're going to see dominantly still growing again. These are the ones coming through the online platforms and direct to consumer, direct to merchant type of engagements. They're not going to go over third-party indirect agents anymore because they feel comfortable now to do big ticket items. So as they're doing big ticket items, travel is a big ticket item, you actually have a larger pie. But many of these are coming with credit cards from countries which don't have a very huge credit line. So they're using debit cards because they have the funds, they've saved the money. So it's not just the luxury aficionados and the affluent segment which is sitting on the money. There's a huge mass market segment which has enough pent-up savings, but they're using debit cards to pay for this. So you have to get yourself ready also to cater to this segment, because fundamentally, they feel safe to using their debit cards. I'm not going to talk about the essential travelers because, again, there's a lot of essential business which is maintaining, and you saw the data points coming from Australia, New Zealand, Asia Pacific markets I showed you in the slide before. Engineers need to travel. We need to travel for some essential business, but it's definitely not the large corporates coming through. So let me show you some data points that we have done here in around. So here's in Australia and New Zealand, you could really see how in 2019-20, the outdoor adventures and the escapists sort of grew. The budget deal seeker didn't grow because we also know in Australia, a lot of the price points went up and a lot of the bookings through the online channels were not actually growing that much more, because the fact is it's a different market than maybe a Singapore or Hong Kong or Japan. They saw more or less remain in the same bucket group. The rejuvenators didn't grow that much because Aussies used to go to their Pacific Islands, as well as also in the luxury cycle, the Pacific Islands or Indonesia, to go and rejuvenate and enjoy the luxury piece. The business, hence that dropped out. What really grew there in Australia was the workation travel, and you can see this. What also dropped out is a long haul visit friends and family because the borders are closed. But what is now funny enough is the first half of 2021, as the luxury aficionados couldn't go to their Pacific Islands and go to Indonesia, they're starting now to pick up this volume. The adventures are growing fundamentally. The outdoor activities is really booming. The elbow-to-elbow type of activities, maybe in Queensland or the beach resorts, is declining further, as well as also the budget deal seekers on the sides of the OTAs trying to find a good deal has declined because fundamentally a lot of the rates have really hiked in Australia. If we look at Japan, the picture is the opposite way around, and you can see here again not much of an outdoor activity society, as well as also the rejuvenators who choose to go to their Pacific Islands, other places, but they went to go discover their Japan area with a bit more longer trips to some secondary destinations on the island. A lot of the volume came through the OTA websites and the direct to operator platforms in the Japanese market, and that trend is continuing there. What had grown in the beginning of 2019 was the workation traveler, but it also went now a bit backwards because of the safety measurements the government has put in place in Japan. Now, Hong Kong, Singapore being two island states is a complete different picture. There's nowhere to go, but I wanted to show you this because, again, you see that people started to try to venture out within their environment, what to do. That the budget deal seeker grew the segment here was also driven by some of the government initiatives in Singapore, for instance, with the Discover Singapore vouchers, which were booked through some of these platforms. But again, the weekend traveler didn't grow because that's usually when the Singaporeans or the Hong Kongs were going to their neighboring countries. As David has explained, that's where basic fundamental traffic goes to. So as 2020 passed away and they didn't go anywhere, at the moment, they're actually rediscovering their own country in a bit more positive way, and they're spending a bit more on luxury within Singapore and Hong Kong. Now with that, I want to basically close off and sort of talk about how, my last slide here is just one slide. You're going to get that deck. It's just the last slide. Here you're actually seeing how the mass in Australia is really spending more. Now, again, why is the affluent and the high net worth individual spending less? Because the long haul ticket is not in there. It's not that they're doing less trips, but the long haul ticket is not there. With the long haul ticket, the average spend obviously per trip is going down. But what we've really seen is the mass. And again, don't forget the mass. They have money, they have pent-up savings. That's why I brought you this trip. And which masses in Australia really driving this? The ones which came new to the online space, as well as also the ones which are new to card usage. So again, Generation Zs, the millennials, which haven't had credit cards before or only using debit cards, are very dominant in this space. The same thing obviously applies for Hong Kong. What I showed you on the Hong Kong side here is why the affluent has dropped out, because that is the consumer which was more dominantly in the most frequent traveler space, combining maybe corporate and leisure travel in the past, just being basically on a more affluent segment and leaving Hong Kong on the longer weekends or on the weekends. And hence this has not happened in the past. As well as also the one which is more related to discretionary spend, which is the nightlife for eating out, enjoying life, and hence again, not being able to fly, not spending on the flight, not doesn't mean that they don't spend for eating out, but there's obviously a drop in the average spend. So let me stop sharing. I want to stop here and I want to bring on my dear colleague Mayank, which is our Vice President for Area Marketing Southeast Asia. And basically say, well, let's look at how do we bring this to action, Mayank? You know, this is super interesting, lovely 6 leisure segments, two new business segments. How do we bring this to action?
Thanks a lot, Andreas, and everybody else. A warm good afternoon, good evening, where you may be. No, absolutely. I think I would start with this anecdote, which I use a lot when I talk to my teams. You can bring the horse to the water, but you can't make it drink, right? So so once you've identified the basic needs, you've segmented, as you rightly shared. These new times have created this whole new slew of personas and segments. So the intent there is that we take what we learn from the data, and then we go into phase 2, which is marry that to something that would make sense, would make a proposition attractive. So if you're looking at travel and you're looking at maybe domestic tourism or you're looking at inbound tourism, while you identify these segments, right, which is great to know because you know what makes them tick, you need to marry that with the right offers, experiences, and passions. Because at the end of it, what's happening, and we see that, right, with some of the partners that we work with, that while on the periphery of it, there is still pent-up demand on travel, but as you kind of scratch the surface, you see that the underlying passion behind the need to travel is still the same. So how do you feed that passion with something different? So that's how we build pyramids of offers and experiences. We go very, very specific to personas. One size will definitely not fit all, right? So we work with obviously internal partners and external partners alike to make sure we have the right offer on the right passion. We look at where customers eat, shop, live, play. So then again, we build an always on calendar or cycle of marketing that can actually get them at the right moments. And again, like we said, every segment is very unique. There may be some overlaps here and there, but we have to really dial that deep into the segment. And that's where it gets very interesting to build marketing out of that.
This is super interesting. So you're taking the spend inside of a segment and really looking into which type of merchants do they spend in. So make an example, if there's a family which does a lot of QSR type of active quick service restaurants, let me use the term which is more used, and does less fine dining, it doesn't make sense to present them with a fine dining experience. It makes more sense obviously to present them with a simple restaurant location where the kids can eat and play and have fun. that the sort of get the pain point, but get that passion point out to them as well and address that.
Absolutely. And as we build the cohorts, right? So you'll also see cross linkages. So for example, people who like a certain type of entertainment, museums, for example, also love Japanese food, right? So now that is where it gets really interesting. And that's where we build palettes of offers. And you're no stranger to test and learn yourself. That becomes a very integral component of what we're trying to do, because while we understand the data really well, our offers are very, very, very connected, very, very rooted to the passions of these people and the spend patterns. We also have to be very flexible on how their behavior may pivot when we serve these offers and experiences to them. So as we go along, the key factor that we use is obviously you test, you learn, you optimize, and then repeat. And you build that cycle of data that always goes back to the source. So for example, as you serve the campaigns, as the campaign runs, be it a tactical campaign or an always on campaign, you keep feeding the data back and you keep refining the insights further. And that's what makes it, again, I'll use a very, very common term, but customization. But it really is very, very customized to that extent, because we want to make sure, because the data doesn't lie. And as we go about making sure the data is fed back into the primary source, we see whether the numbers change or not. Is the spend increasing? Is the stickiness of the customer increasing? And us and our partners and the banks that we work with do share that information with us as well, saying that, you know what, we've seen certain category spends going up. And again, it's all about how well we define the segments right at the beginning, like you showed. And that feeds into pretty much everything else that follows suit after that. And last but not the least is the creative hook. Very, very important that you build a creative hook that resonates with the segment that you're going after, the segments that you're going after. A lot of the times, we have great offers, but we don't proposition it the right way, and that's where it gets a bit weaker. And that's where again, test and learn comes into. We look at different creative messaging and not just offer messaging on what makes the customer quote unquote bite at the offer, right? And then that feeds into the lookalike cohorts as well, and that's how marketing kind of becomes like a circular loop.
So let me take a couple of interesting thoughts you had there. Let me start first with the creative / let's talk about the creative piece. So yes, I get this lovely advertising from my hotel chain, which I always am a member with, and it's always this pool with kids around. I got no kids, hence I turn it off immediately. So that's where you're telling me. Our spend data would actually tell very much that Andreas has no kids. Hence, I need to make sure that the creative I'm using for Andreas for the same hotel property has the non-kids related type of visualizations to it and the messaging. Whereas, David, who has 2 lovely kids, will probably have an appreciation. Oh, this is a safe pool. I would like to go for that. So data really helps you create also the creatives at the back end.
Absolutely. And, for example, if you're looking at lifestyle couples, affluent couples, you'll have a very different palette of messaging compared to a young family. You wouldn't, again, like I said, it's wasted marketing dollars. We are all super stretched. Our partners alike cannot afford to make a dollar get wasted. So that's the reason why, yes, data absolutely feeds into defining that. And not even that, it's also defined into the channels we use. Now, knowing the segment of customers or consumers we're going after, right, will define what media strategy I use. So a great creative, a great offer, but a bad media strategy, again, sets you back, right? So that's where it's very, very important. You wouldn't want to have a great offer and a great asset and you end up doing a print ad on a digital native consumer that you're targeting. That's just complete waste of money. And similarly, the channels within that you use, but if you're going after somebody who's in their 50s, broadly speaking, affluent clientele who are luxury travelers, you wouldn't take TikTok as your means to get them to bite at the offer that you have. So that kind of becomes very, very critical. And like I said, data is right at the beginning of the cycle and also at the end of the cycle. It's very, very important that it's kind of stapled together.
So let me now go to another comment you made, again, related to data. You used a term which is called test and learn. And I know many of my customers say, Andreas, but this is 2019, 2018 data. Is that not outdated? And I always tell them, well, it's sometimes, maybe not the most relevant data. It is outdated. You have no in data. So we can add new spend data, which is now obviously from home. But people tend to behave at home the way they behave away from home. People tend to, that's why you mentioned these cohorts between the rest of the museum visitors and the Japanese restaurants. So is what you do with test and learn? You sort of build these similar type of data insights so that you understand what was here pre-COVID / at the beginning, or what is at home at this very moment will resonate with them what is away? Is that a way of building this new in-data type of a view?
Absolutely. I think from a media strategy standpoint, it's very, very important that so as you define a segment and you overlay the creative strategy on there, again, there's test and learn even in the creative strategy. Am I going to use positive messaging? Am I going to use emotional messaging? Am I going to use rational messaging? So you can test a few of these parameters as the campaign rolls out for one segment. And on top of that is basically the media strategy loop as well. Like I just spoke about, which channel are you going to use? What frequency are you going to use? Some people who are time poor would get really irritated by being pinged multiple times about an offer, which is kind of not making sense to them, versus somebody who's like really has a lot of spare time on their hands, like most of us do these days, right? Waiting for people to serve us offers. So I think the critical element here to answer your point was, yes, as we go along, this creative strategy, this media strategy builds actually a more relevant data set. And that's what we try to feed back into the data pool, saying, you know what? And the next time we do a campaign like this for a segment, broad-based segment like that, we have very, very fresh data that we can utilize into creating media strategies and marketing strategies, and then speed to market becomes much easier.
So that test and learn engine takes this data always back in again and refines that cycle, so it becomes better and better and better, because we're probably never going to have the right set right at the beginning, but it's that learning piece which comes to it. So it's AI driven, it's artificial intelligence driven. Now, artificial intelligence is useless if you don't still put some form of our execution behind it, but it is now the new norm that you have to have some technology which helps you drill that down.
No, absolutely. And we rely not just on technology that we possess as Mastercard. We look at what partners do as well. There's a lot of social listening that's going on. There's a lot of fresh insights and data that comes from there as well. A lot of campaign, results, and not the financial results, but how a campaign is performing. You really do get a lot of social buzz. You come to know whether it's really making the ripples that you wanted to make. That should feed into an AI-driven mechanism. And we at Mastercard, we do have the marketing engine that does something similar, which takes out these latent insights, these very, very current social insights. And again, not everybody has $1 million to spend on a campaign. A lot of the times we're all stretched for the dollar, as I said at the top of the conversation. And that's where tools like these come in. You don't need to spray and pray. You don't need to waste your time waiting for other people to give you insights of 5 years ago. So that's where, we try to look for the right tools, for the right combination of partners and us, and also the kind of campaign and the budget that we have.
So this is good. Now I want to stretch this into a slightly different area, because it's super interesting. Media, the right data, get the right cohort, get the creative, change the creative if it doesn't work. Now, I spoke to an airline company the other week, and it was like, okay, when are my frequent flyers coming back? And many of these frequent flyers are corporates, and as we just mentioned, corporates are not most likely to come back. So by the time this long-haul travel and this long-haul frequent flyer comes back, we're going to be looking a couple of years down the road in the same volume. So now the question comes, how do I fill the bottom of the funnel to become new travelers? And we're seeing a lot of Generation Z and millennials. They have money, they have pent-up savings. How do you talk to these consumers, which have a super short time of attention? They're constantly on, they're super tech savvy. What is your advice here without spending $10 million trying to get to them? Because there's the next big segment.
Absolutely. And, digital natives as they are, they just eat, breathe, sleep digital all the time. Their attention span is very, very short. They're also they're very quick at, reacting to something that catches their fancy as well. So that's very, very important. And like you said, needs to be very, very current. And we do have tools that tap into that behavior, right? So like I said, you don't want to have a very traditional approach to marketing anymore, right? So not just because of the fact that they're Gen Zs, but it's also to the fact that if you're spending $100, right, nobody's going out there and doing public service. You want to make something back. You want to have some KPIs that would move, be it spend, stickiness, engagement, or whatever the case may be. Then speed to market is very, very important, and the right messaging is important. So I think that's where the tools come in. Like I touched upon, the marketing engine is one such tool. It is created specifically for an audience like this, because all our partners need to do, honestly, is plug and play. They get into this environment, they're able to see real-time insights basis the segment they define, right? And they're able to use creatives that are modeled real-time using AI, on the same engine, and using the same engine, they can plug into the social profile and execute. Now, how easy is that? Obviously, a lot of hard work goes behind, but from my perspective, I've used it myself, right, with some partners here in Asia, and the results are amazing. Because a lot of the times, usually what happens for the traditional campaigns, as we call them, right, you brief an agency, the agency takes time, comes back with insights you already know sometimes, and we want to cut that queue, we want to cut that time short, especially for consumers like these who are digital natives, have very, very small attention spans, they have amazing amount of time online. How do you get them at the right platform at the right moment with the right message? And I think speed is the key, and that's what the engine does.
Speed. So that segment needs to be addressed with speed. We're almost at the top of the hour. I want to just quickly look into the Q&A section. There's an interesting question here about what's happening on the long haul with global warming and what's happening on the long haul travel in that space here. Let me just give a bit of a view on long haul, okay? And that's coming back from what David mentioned, what we've seen in the overall behavior. Long haul is an expensive trip. And now you're going to have to fill the front of the cabin so that the back of the cabin becomes cheap. So if you don't have the corporate travel, which is filling in the back of the front of the cabin, you're going to have to, on the long haul side, obviously see the back of the cabin either increase the prices or the frequencies will not come up. So will that lower the carbon footprint? Will that, what's the overall balance? I think there's going to be a shift and a balance around between what we've done the last 2 decades, flying around like crazy. This is my personal view, okay? This is not a Mastercard view. Flying around like crazy for everything, where you're going to see a longer recovery of some of the long haul destinations, especially in terms of flight frequencies, as well as opportunity. In the old days, just with Starlines, I could have had 50 different opportunities to fly to Switzerland out of Singapore. Nowadays, I have about 7. And that's going to take a long time to bring it back up to 50 different flights a week to sort of fly out of Singapore on a Starlines network to go to Switzerland. Hence, that will automatically change the way long haul is coming across. The question which remains is, how expensive will long haul be? Because if the front of the cabin is not able to keep each flight profitable, sooner or later the airlines are going to have to make the back of the cabin pay for the flight. And that leads to a closing remark from our side. Travel is here. Travel is not going to return back to what it was pre-COVID 2019, but you're going to see a lot of travel coming back very fast within your region, in shorter distances, to your neighboring countries. Show the love to the neighboring countries, because they're going to be the first ones which bring you the first volume of travel consumers coming back, because that's where either the consumer has options to come by car if it's within Southeast Asia, shorter flights, cheaper flights, or where you at least have huge consumer supply sides which want to travel, being in a Chinese market, a Japanese market, an Australian market, they will travel. Will the big markets from overseas, Europe and the USA, come fast back into Asia Pacific? I have my views. It's going to take a bit longer on that, but that's why you're going to be targeting a lot more your Asia Pacific customers. With that, Paul, you want to have some closing words, right?
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to thank yourself and David and Mayank. That was a great presentation, really some great information. So thank you so much. Thank you for everyone at Mastercard, our good friends and partners there. You can turn off your camera and I'll just do a quick wrap up for everybody else here. So some of you might have a question regarding the presentations. If you're interested in any of the presentations you saw here, please do send us an email. We will connect you with our friends at Mastercard, and they will then provide you with the information that you request. Just wanted to go through a couple last things. So if you enjoyed this webinar, we do have many sessions coming up, especially exclusively for our PATA members. As you know, today's webinar was created especially just for our PATA members. So next week we do have as part of our newly launched PATA Innovation Series on digital marketing. This is top PR and marketing tips for small hotels. This is presented by Linda Williams, the founder and MD at Vim and Vigor. We do have a couple more webinars will be launched the following week as well. So please do keep an eye about that. Visit our website, subscribe to our newsletter. Please do keep an eye. We will be launching a couple more webinars, workshops in the next few weeks. So to keep updated about that. We do also have our event on September 2nd to the 5th. And this is our virtual Pot of Travel Mart 2021 in conjunction with the Sichuan International Travel Expo. You still have time to register as either a buyer or seller. I think you'll be able to register as a visitor at some point. I'm not sure if that is available yet, but please do keep a lookout for that as well. I don't have a slide here for that, but we will be launching our virtual Pot of Travel Mart 2021 mini-series on luxury and wellness travel. So you've heard a little bit about how luxury will be sort of important going forward. So we will have that event later this year as well. So please do keep an eye out for that information. As I said, please subscribe to our newsletter or check in on our website, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter to keep updated on all our upcoming activities. And with that, if you have any questions about today's webinar, I said if you want the presentations, feel free to contact me. My email address is right there. That's paul@pata.org. All information is right on our website, and there it is, www.pata.org. You can also see a lot of our previous webinars that you might have missed. They are on our YouTube channel, so that's just search Pata TV, and you can see a lot of our past webinars, like the Destination Insights series we just had with Cambodia just last week. With that, once again, I'd like to thank our good friends at Mastercard, Andreas, Mayuk, and David. I'd like to thank, of course, all of our Pata members, our life members, our chapter members. You know, without your continued support, none of this could be possible. And of course, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I hopefully will see you at our next webinar, and stay safe, take care, and I'll see you soon.